The night of 30th of June 1944 was warm and windless at the Château de la Roche-Guyon, the Renaissance palace on the Great Bend of the Seine that had become headquarters for Army Group B. Inside the high-ceilinged map room, a single green-shaded lamp threw a cone of light across the situation table. The rest of the chamber lay in shadow, as if the darkness itself had been ordered to stand at attention. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt sat alone in that circle of light, coat unbuttoned, collar open, the knight's cross at his throat catching the lamplight like a drop of frozen blood. He was 68 years old, his face carved deep by 5 decades of war, his left arm half useless from an old French bullet, his spine rigid with arthritis and Prussian pride. He did not pace. He did not swear. He simply stood and looked at the map as though it were a corpse on a mortuary slab, and he the only doctor willing to pronounce it dead. The map told the story without mercy. Thick red arrows, drawn that afternoon by a trembling intelligence officers, pushed inland from Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Between those arrows, the blue symbols that represented what remained of the 7th Army and Panzer Group West had shrunk to scattered rectangles and tiny squares, many of them already crossed through with the red X that meant destroyed or annihilated or simply no longer answers the radio. Cherbourg was a red circle closing hour by hour. San was a bleeding wound. The Cotentin Peninsula had been sliced away like a gangrenous limb, and still the Allied convoys kept coming across the channel, an endless iron river under a sky that belonged entirely to the enemy. Rundstedt reached for the silver cigarette case that had followed him from the trenches of 1914 to the Victory Parade in Paris in 1940. His fingers, thin and veined like old parchment, opened it with the same deliberate care he once used to unfold operational orders before the Kaiser. He lit the cigarette, inhaled once, and let the smoke drift toward the painted gods on the ceiling who had watched French kings feast while armies died outside their windows. He remembered the morning of 6th June as clearly as if it were happening again in front of him. He had been asleep at his headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye because the Führer had forbidden any major movement of reserves without his personal approval, and the Führer refused to be woken before midday. By the time Hitler finally rose, shaved, and took his first tablets, the Allies had already put 156,000 men ashore and were unloading tanks as casually as if they were on autumn maneuvers. Rommel had driven through the night from Germany, arriving coatless and wild-eyed, shouting that everything must be thrown against the beaches at once. Rundstedt had looked at the younger man with the wariness of a father watching a son discover fire for the first time. "My dear Rommel," he had said, voice dry as winter leaves, "you may commit whatever forces you still control. I no longer control any. The OKW controls them, and the OKW is waiting for a weather report from the Führer's astrologer." Rommel had stared at him speechless, and in that silence, Rundstedt had felt the first cold premonition that this time there would be no miracle. Now, 25 days later, the miracle had still not arrived. Instead, the 7th Army was bleeding to death in the hedgerows. The panzer divisions were parked in woods and orchards, their crews forbidden to move by day because the Jabos ruled the sky with casual, murderous precision. Every attempt to shift a single battalion toward the front required written permission from Rastenburg, countersigned by Keitel, approved by Jodl, and finally blessed by the trembling hand of the man in the wolf's lair, who saw enemies in every shadow and traitors behind every map. Rundstedt walked slowly to the tall windows that overlooked the Seine. Moonlight lay on the river like spilled mercury. Somewhere downstream, the first American patrols were already across the water, probing, tasting, preparing the next bite. He could hear nothing of them. The night fighters and the constant, distant thump of bombs drowned everything else. Yet he felt their presence the way an old wolf feels the pack closing from every direction. Behind him, the field telephone rang, shrill and urgent. He did not turn. His adjutant, Major von Tempelhof, appeared in the doorway, helmet under his arm, face chalk white in the lamplight. "Herr Generalfeldmarschall, urgent from Cherbourg. General von Schlieben reports the fortress is encircled. Ammunition almost gone, water for perhaps one more day. He requests permission to attempt a breakout to the south." Rundstedt spoke without looking round. Permission denied. He will hold the port to the last round and the last man. Those are the Führer's orders. Tempelhof hesitated. He says with respect that the last round was fired this afternoon, sir. A long silence. Then Rundstedt turned. The lamplight carved deep trenches beneath his eyes. Then tell him to use bayonets. Tell him to use teeth if necessary, but the port is to be denied to the enemy. That is the order. Tempelhof saluted and vanished. The door closed with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Rundstedt returned to the map. He picked up a blue pencil, and, with the neatness of a man who had spent his life drawing arrows that conquered nations, he crossed through the symbol for the 77th Infantry Division. Then the 352nd. Then the 709th. One by one, like a priest administering extreme unction, he cancelled the units that had ceased to exist that day. When he finished, the western half of the Cotentin Peninsula was almost empty of blue. He lit another cigarette from the butt of the first and stood listening to the night. Somewhere a battery of Nebelwerfer rockets sighed overhead, bound for the American lines. The sound was thin, almost apologetic, the last cry of a dying animal. He thought of the reports he had sent east over these 25 days. Careful, measured, professional reports that grew shorter with each passing night, because there was less and less to say that would not be considered defeatism. He had written of local penetrations, of elastic withdrawals, of shortening the front for decisive counterattack. He had written those lies the way a condemned man writes appeals he knows will never be read. And every night the telephone had rung again, and Keitel's voice oily with fear, Jodel's clipped and furious, and always in the background the shouting, the endless drug-thick shouting that no one was allowed to name. "What shall we do?" they asked, as if he were a magician who had simply forgotten the correct spell. He had stopped answering with plans. He simply said, "As the Führer orders," and the front bled on. But tonight the cigarette tasted of ash, and the map looked like the face of a friend he had personally executed. Tonight the silence after the telephone stopped ringing was heavier than any bombardment. Tonight, in the Château de la Roche-Guyon, beneath frescoes of nymphs and gods who had never known total war, the oldest soldier in the German army felt something shift inside his chest, like ice breaking on a winter river. 25 days of silence. 25 days of watching a continent die by inches. 25 days of swallowing the sentence that must never be spoken aloud in the Third Reich. He looked once more at the red arrows devouring Normandy, at the empty spaces where armies had been, at the moonlit river sliding past as if nothing at all was wrong. And in the cold, quiet depths of his Prussian soul, the truth that had been waiting patiently since the morning of 6th of June finally stirred, stretched, and opened its eyes. And after 25 days of silence, the truth was finally ready to erupt. Gerd von Rundstedt was born on 12th of December 1875 in Aschersleben, a small garrison town in Saxony-Anhalt, where the air always smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. His earliest memory was the sound of boots on cobblestones at dawn and the silhouette of his father, Major General Gerd von Rundstedt, riding out of the courtyard in the silver helmet of a cuirassier. The boy stood on the balcony in his nightshirt, small fist clenched around the iron railing, already understanding that a man's worth was measured by how straight he sat in the saddle and how quietly he accepted orders. The Rundstedts were not rich aristocrats. They were soldiers who had served the Hohenzollerns since the 30 Years' War. Their coat of arms showed a black eagle clutching a broken sword, symbol of a family that had lost battles, but never honor. Young Gerd grew up believing that defeat was tolerable if it was honorable. Surrender was not. At the cadet school in Potsdam, the instructors beat that conviction deeper into him with canes and cold showers. He learned to ride, to fence, to read a map by moonlight, and above all, to keep his face expressionless when pain or fear threatened to show. In 1914, when the lamps went out across Europe, Lieutenant von Rundstedt rode to war as adjutant to a cavalry division on the Western Front. Within weeks, the horses were dead and the sabers useless, but the discipline remained. He spent 4 years in the mud of Flanders, rising from lieutenant to major, learning that modern war was mathematics dressed in blood. At Verdun, he watched entire battalions vanish in a single morning and discovered that the only thing more terrifying than accurate French artillery was inaccurate German staff work. He also learned that empires die slowly, in committee rooms as much as on battlefields, and that the men who shout loudest about victory are usually the furthest from the front. Between the wars, he served the fragile Weimar Republic without loving it, because a Prussian officer serves the state, not the government. He watched the Freikorps murder communists in the streets, watched the Reichswehr shrink to a shadow, watched politicians sell Germany's honor for loans and illusions. He kept his mouth shut and his uniform immaculate. When the Nazis came, he accepted the new oath to Hitler the way he had once accepted the oath to the Kaiser, as a professional necessity, not a spiritual conversion. He told himself the brown-shirted madness would burn itself out once the professionals were back in control. By 1939, he was 63, officially retired, living quietly in Kassel with his wife Louise and their son Hans Gerd. Then came the telephone call from Brauchitsch, Poland. He returned to uniform without enthusiasm and without protest. The campaign lasted 18 days. France in 1940 took 6 weeks. Both victories were so complete that they felt unreal, like dreams from which one must eventually wake. Rundstedt commanded Army Group South in Poland and Army Grey in France, masterminding the sickle cut through the Ardennes that no French general believed possible. Paris fell on his birthday present to the Führer. He stood on the Champs-Élysées while the bands played and told himself that perhaps this time, Germany had finally won the war it had lost in 1918. Russia cured him of that illusion. In June 1941, he led Army Group South toward Kiev and the Black Sea, watching the horizon fill with dust clouds that never seemed to end. He took 1 million prisoners at Kiev, the largest encirclement in history, and still the Red Army came on. By December, his armies were outside Moscow, men freezing to death in summer uniforms because someone in Berlin had believed the campaign would be over by autumn. He sent a memorandum advising halt and consolidation. Hitler replied by relieving him of command for the first time. Rundstedt packed his bags without a word, handed over to Reichenau, and went home to Kassel. 6 months later, after Reichenau conveniently died of a heart attack, Hitler summoned him back, because no one else understands the West. He returned to find the Reich at its zenith and already rotting from inside. The party commissars were everywhere now, watching, reporting, demanding ideological fervor from men who only wanted to know where the next shell was coming from. The OKW had become a new department whose sole purpose was to rewrite history faster than the front could contradict it. Officers who spoke plainly disappeared into night and fog. Rundstedt retreated behind a mask of icy courtesy. He signed orders he knew were nonsense, attended endless ceremonies where Goering's medals clinked like wind chimes, and waited for the inevitable. Yet something hardened in him that had never quite hardened before. Each lie he was forced to endorse, each division squandered on a whim, each truthful report returned with red pencil marks demanding more optimism, carved another notch in the wall of his patience. He began to keep a private notebook, small, black, locked, in which he wrote the actual strengths of his armies, the real losses, the accurate distances to the next river line. He never showed it to anyone, but its very existence was an act of rebellion. By 1944, he had seen 3 German states rise and fall: Empire, Republic, Reich. 3 wars begin with parades and end in ashes. He had watched the Kaiser flee to Holland, the President flee to Paris, and now he watched the Führer flee from reality into a bunker of maps and amphetamines. He understood, with the clarity of a man who has nothing left to lose except his honor, that the Third Reich was not fighting the Allies so much as it was fighting arithmetic. And arithmetic always wins. In March 1944, when Hitler summoned him yet again to command the Western Front, Rundstedt accepted with the same calm he had shown when accepting dismissal. He knew what was coming. He had seen the Allied bombers turn the Ruhr into a moonscape. He had read the intelligence summaries showing American factories producing more aircraft in a month than Germany had built in all of 1943. He had watched Rommel pace the Atlantic Wall like a caged wolf, pleading for the Panzer divisions to be released from Hitler's personal grip. Rundstedt did not plead. He simply prepared for defeat, the way a good staff officer prepares for any contingency. Methodically, without passion, without hope. He told Rommel, "We shall do our duty, and we shall lose. The only question is how long they allow us to postpone the inevitable." Rommel, still burning with the desert fire, could not accept that. Rundstedt envied him the illusion, but he no longer shared it. Now, in the summer of 1944, the postponement was over. The Allies were ashore in strength, the Luftwaffe was a memory, the Kriegsmarine was rusting in port, and the Führer's headquarters issued orders based on where divisions had been 3 weeks earlier. Rundstedt moved his pieces on the great chessboard of France with the detachment of a man playing against a child who cheats. He knew what defeat looked like. He had seen it before. He had seen it in the eyes of French generals in the railway carriage at Compiègne in 1940, eyes that already knew the war was lost, even as they signed the armistice. He had seen it in the faces of his own soldiers outside Moscow in 1941, black with frostbite and despair. And now he saw it every day in the mirror. The calm, gray, unblinking stare of a man who has measured the distance to the abyss and discovered it is shorter than anyone in Berlin is willing to admit. He knew what defeat looked like, because he had spent 50 years studying victory and discovering, again and again, that victory is only ever rented. The bill always comes due. He knew what defeat looked like, and he was watching it arrive on schedule. He knew what defeat looked like. He had seen it before. The Wolfschanze, East Prussia, 28th of June, 1944. Midnight conference in the map room that smelled of damp pine, wet uniforms, and the sour sweat of frightened men. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the chemical tension. Hitler stood hunched over the central table, one hand braced on the edge, the other trembling as it stabbed a colored pencil at Normandy. His face was gray-yellow under the harsh bulbs, pupils pin-wide from pervitin and rage. Around him the generals formed a silent half-circle, backs straight, eyes fixed on nothing. Keitel, chief of the OKW, read from a folder in a voice that tried to sound calm and succeeded only in sounding strangled. Army Group B reports successful elastic defense west of San. Local enemy penetrations contained. Panzer Group West preparing decisive counterattack. Hitler's head snapped up. Contained? The word cracked like a pistol shot. I see no containment. I see the enemy 30 kilometers inland. Where are my panzers? Where is the Luftwaffe? Goering, bloated in pale blue silk, muttered something about weather and flak corridors. No one listened. Rundstedt was not present. He had been excused from the midnight flights to Rostenburg weeks earlier. His doctors claimed the altitude aggravated his heart. In truth, Hitler no longer wanted the old field marshal's cold eyes in the same room when the maps were opened. The eyes saw too much. Instead, Rundstedt attended by telephone, patched through from La Roche-Guyon at whatever hour the Führer's insomnia peaked. The ritual was always the same. At 0200 or 300, the field telephone would shriek. Major von Tempelhof would answer, listen, pale, then carry the handset to Rundstedt as though it were wired to explode. That night, the call came at 3117. Rundstedt, already awake and dressed, took the receiver without hurry. Keitel's voice, thin and metallic across 500 kilometers of cable. The Führer wishes your appreciation of the situation, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. Rundstedt glanced at the latest teletype on his desk. 91st Air Landing Division destroyed, 709th Static wiped out, LX 14 Corps reduced to regimental Kampfgruppen, Panzer Lair at 23 tanks. He closed his eyes for a second, then spoke in the measured tone he might have used to order breakfast. The situation is that the 7th Army is being systematically annihilated. We have lost tactical freedom of movement. The enemy enjoys absolute air supremacy and overwhelming material superiority. Every attempt to concentrate armor is detected and destroyed from the air before it can detrain. In plain language, we are losing the campaign in the West at a rate of 1 division every 48 hours. A long silence. Then Keitel, almost whispering, "The Führer expects a more energetic tone, Herr Generalfeldmarschall." Rundstedt felt something snap inside him, a small, clean sound like a dry twig. Then tell the Führer that energy without ammunition is merely noise. He hung up before Keitel could stammer a reply. That was the night the blind fortress began to show its first hairline cracks. The fortress had been built brick by brick over years. Every unfavorable report was softened on its way up the chain. Every optimistic fantasy was sharpened on its way down. Generals learned to write "situation difficult but under control" when they meant "we are being exterminated." Staff officers developed a new language: temporary withdrawal for headlong flight, planned disengagement for rout, enemy air activity lively for a sky black with bombers. Bad news became treason. Good news, even when invented, became career fuel. At the center of the fortress sat Hitler, fed a diet of victories that existed only on paper. Around him orbited Keitel and Jodl, terrified of being the messenger who brought reality into the bunker. They censored, they threatened, they shot. Field commanders who told the truth, like General Stulpnagel in Paris, like General von Falkenhausen in Belgium, were replaced by men whose loyalty was measured by their willingness to lie. Rommel tried to breach the walls. On the 17th of June, he drove to Berchtesgaden and begged Hitler face to face: release the Panzer reserves, allow operational freedom, or the West is lost within weeks. Hitler smiled, offered cake, promised wonder weapons, and sent him away with nothing. 3 days later, Rommel wrote to Rundstedt, "The man is living on the moon." Rundstedt did not answer the letter. He simply filed it in the locked drawer with his private notebook. On the 29th of June, Rommel was caught in the open near Liverath by 2 typhoons. His staff car shredded, driver dead, Rommel himself hurled into a ditch with a fractured skull. He would live, but he would never command again. The Desert Fox, the only general the troops still believed in, was removed from the board by a 19-year-old pilot who would never know whose life he had ended. Rundstedt received the news while shaving. He paused, razor in hand, looked at his reflection, and said aloud to the empty bathroom, "One less realist. How convenient for Berlin." That same afternoon, Günther von Kluge arrived to replace Rommel as commander of Army Group B. Kluge was fresh from the Eastern Front, full of National Socialist enthusiasm and contempt for the defeatist atmosphere in France. He shook Rundstedt's hand with theatrical vigor. "I bring the Führer's complete confidence, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. We shall turn the tide yet." Rundstedt studied the newcomer the way a surgeon studies a tumor. "Welcome to Normandy, Herr von Kluge. I trust you brought your own tide." Kluge laughed, thinking it a joke. Rundstedt did not. Within a week, Kluge's laughter had curdled. He drove the front daily, dodging J-boats, watching battalions dissolve under naval gunfire, reading reports that grew more fantastical with every kilometer closer to Berlin. On the 28th of June, he telephoned Rundstedt at 400, voice hoarse with exhaustion and something close to panic. "My God, Rundstedt, it's worse than Russia. They have everything: air, tanks, shells, replacements. We have nothing. Nothing. How have you endured this for weeks?" Rundstedt's reply was soft, almost gentle. "I endure it the way one endures cancer, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. One simply waits for the appropriate amount of time." Kluge was silent so long Rundstedt thought the connection had failed. The blind fortress was now under siege from within as well as without. Even its architects were beginning to see the cracks. Keitel phoned twice a day, pleading for constructive suggestions. Jodl sent furious signals demanding unyielding resistance while privately confessing to his diary that the war was lost. Himmler's SS liaison officers prowled headquarters corridors, taking names. And still the front shrank. Saint-Lô fell. Coutances was encircled. The Americans reached Avranches. Every day another town, another river, another irreplaceable battalion vanished from the map. On the night of 30th of June, Rundstedt sat alone again in the lamplight at La Roche-Guyon. The château was almost empty. Most of the staff had been sent rearward to avoid capture. Outside, the Seine kept sliding past, indifferent. Inside, the silence pressed like deep water. He opened his private notebook and wrote in his neat, staff officer hand, "Day 25 since invasion. 7th Army, 11 divisions combat ineffective. Panzer Group West, 110 tanks operational of 1,800 on 6th of June. Luftflotte 3, 80 serviceable aircraft. Enemy estimated strength ashore, 1,200,000 men, 220,000 vehicles. Conclusion unchanged." He closed the book, locked it, and stared at the telephone. He knew what came next. He had known for weeks. The fortress could not survive another honest arithmetic much longer. Someone would have to speak the forbidden numbers aloud. Someone would have to name the cancer. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise toward the painted ceiling, where gods and goddesses still danced in an eternal summer that no longer existed anywhere on Earth. He wasn't watching a defeat any longer. He was watching a system eat itself alive. Firth, July 1944, 11:42 a.m. Château de la Roche-Guyon. The morning was already hot, a dry, dusty heat that crept through the open windows and settled over the map room like a fever. Rundstedt had not slept. He had sat in the same chair since 400, coat off, collar undone, a single glass of Armagnac untouched in front of him. The great situation map had not been updated since the night report. There was no longer any point. The red arrows had eaten everything worth eating. At 11:42, the field telephone rang with the special double ring that meant Wolfschanze direct. Mayor von Tempelhof appeared in the doorway, face rigid with dread. Herr Generalfeldmarschall, General Oberst Keitel for you. The Führer is listening on the extension. Rundstedt rose slowly. His knees cracked like old timber. He walked to the instrument, picked up the heavy bakelite receiver, and spoke in the same quiet voice he had used on battlefields for half a century. Rundstedt. Keitel's voice came first, high and trembling with the strain of a man trying to sound confident while standing next to a loaded pistol. Good morning, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. The Führer has asked me to obtain your latest appreciation. The situation map here shows a certain tension west of Saint-Lô. What shall we do? A pause. The only sound was the faint buzz of the open line, and far away, the thump of bombs falling on Seine. Rundstedt looked once more at the map. He saw the American spearheads slicing toward Avranches, the British grinding forward south of Seine, the remnants of Panzer Group West reduced to a thin gray smear. He saw Cherbourg gone, the Cotentin gone, the entire 7th Army hanging by a thread that was already fraying. He thought of the boys dying in the bocage right now, of the telephone exchanges full of officers forging reports, of Kluge's shaking hands, of Rommel lying unconscious in a hospital bed with his skull cracked open. And then, quite suddenly, the last restraint inside him simply dissolved. He spoke slowly, clearly into the silence. Was sollen wir tun? Machen Sie doch endlich den verdammten Krieg zu. Was sonst können Sie noch tun? What shall we do? Then for God's sake end this damned war. What else can you possibly do? There was no shout, no drama. Just the flat, exhausted statement of an old man who had run out of synonyms for catastrophe. On the other end of the line, he heard Keitel's sharp intake of breath, almost a sob. Then a click as someone else, Hitler, slammed his receiver down so hard the handset in Rundstedt's hand jumped. Keitel came back on, voice cracking. Herr Generalfeldmarschall, do you realize what you have just said? Perfectly, Rundstedt answered. I have said what every soldier at the front already knows. Good day. He replaced the receiver with deliberate care, as though laying down a weapon. For perhaps 10 seconds, the map room was utterly still. Tempelhof stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock ticked. Outside, a flight of thunderbolts roared overhead, hunting the last German trucks on the road to Paris. Then the telephone rang again. Tempelhof did not move. Rundstedt lifted it himself. Keitel again, almost hysterical. You are to consider yourself relieved of command immediately. You will hand over to Generalfeldmarschall von Kluge and report to the Führer's headquarters at once to explain your conduct. I shall do nothing of the sort, Rundstedt said calmly. I am 68 years old, and I do not fly to East Prussia to be shouted at by corporals. My resignation is already on your desk. Goodbye, Keitel. He hung up a second time. This time the instrument stayed silent. Within an hour the official signal arrived. Generalfeldmarschall von Rundstedt is placed on the retired list for reasons of health. Generalfeldmarschall von Kluge assumes command in the West with immediate effect. Rundstedt read it, folded it once, and dropped it into the wastepaper basket. Then he called for his valet and began packing. That afternoon Kluge arrived, ashen-faced, still wearing the dust of the front. My God, Rundstedt, what have you done? They're saying you told the Führer to surrender. Not surrender, Rundstedt corrected gently. End the war. There is a difference. One is honorable, the other is merely overdue. Kluge stared at him as though he had sprouted horns. They will shoot you for this. Perhaps, Rundstedt said, closing his suitcase. But they will lose the war anyway. At least I will not have to watch the last act. He left La Roche-Guyon that evening in a single staff car, accompanied only by Tempelhof and his driver. The sentries at the gate saluted with tears in their eyes. No one cheered. Cheering had become dangerous. But as the car disappeared down the long lime avenue toward Paris, every man there knew he had just witnessed something rarer than any victory. An old Prussian telling the truth to power and walking away alive. Behind him, the collapse accelerated. On 3rd of July, Kluge, now bearing the full weight of command, tried to hold the line west of Saint-Lô with divisions that existed only on paper. On the 9th of July, he wrote to Hitler begging for permission to withdraw behind the Seine. The reply was a scream of rage and an order to attack. Kluge attacked. The attack was wiped out in 4 hours. On the 17th of July, Rommel's car was finally strafed. He would linger in coma for months, then be forced to take poison in October. On the 20th of July, Colonel von Stauffenberg's bomb exploded in the Wolfschanze. The conspiracy failed and the purge began. Kluge, tainted by association, would swallow cyanide in August. By 25th of July, the Americans broke out at Saint-Lô. By 15th August, Paris was rising. By 25th of August, the Seine was crossed in a dozen places. Everything Rundstedt had seen coming on 1st of July happened on schedule, only faster. In 6 weeks, the German army in France lost 400,000 men, half of them prisoners. The road to Germany lay open, and in a quiet villa outside Kassel, the dismissed field marshal sat on his terrace each evening, smoking his last Egyptian cigarettes and listening to the BBC on a hidden radio. He never once did he say, "I told you so." He did not need to. The newsreader did it for him, night after night. The truth had cost him his command, his baton, almost his life. The lies cost Germany everything. They brought him back in September 1944, because there was no one else left. Kluge had poisoned himself on a roadside near Metz after the Führer's voice on the telephone accused him of treason. Rommel was dead by his suicide, arranged with the courtesy of a pistol or a vial of cyanide, depending on which version Berlin preferred that week. Model had been sent west with the nickname the Führer's fireman. But even firemen need water, and there was none. So, on the 4th of September, a staff car with SS plates pulled up outside Rundstedt's villa in Kassel. A nervous colonel stepped out, clicked his heels, and delivered Hitler's personal order. The old field marshal was to resume command of the Western Front immediately. Rundstedt received the man in his study, wearing a civilian cardigan, slippers, and the same expression he might have worn if asked to polish boots. "Tell the Führer," he said, "that I am retired, permanently. Find someone younger who still believes in miracles." The colonel, sweating despite the autumn chill, produced a second envelope. Inside was a handwritten note from Hitler. "I need you. Germany needs you. I was too hasty in July. Come back. No questions will be asked." Rundstedt read it twice, folded it, and handed it back. "Very well, but on one condition. I will not attend another situation conference in Rostenburg. If the Führer wishes to shout at me, he may do so by telephone." The colonel almost wept with relief. 2 days later, Rundstedt arrived at the new headquarters near Bad Godesberg. The building was half ruined by bombs. The windows were boarded. The corridors smelled of mildew and fear. The staff officers who greeted him looked 10 years older than in June. Many wore black armbands for brothers, sons, fathers already gone. They saluted with something close to reverence. No one mentioned 1st July. He took command the way a surgeon takes a corpse, without hope, but with professional calm. The front was now the Rhine. France was lost, Belgium was falling, Aachen was burning. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last mad throw, was already being planned in secret. Rundstedt read the orders, closed the folder, and told his chief of staff, General Westphal, "Prepare the attack exactly as written, and prepare the retreat that will follow exactly as I write it. Both will be needed." Westphal understood. No one else dared. The Battle of the Bulge began on 16th of December in snow and fog. For 3 days the panzers rolled forward, and the Americans reeled. For 3 days the old magic seemed to flicker again. Then the sky cleared, the Jabos returned in their thousands, and the miracle bled to death on the roads around Bastogne. Rundstedt signed the withdrawal order on Christmas Eve, knowing it would be ignored until too late. It was. By March 1945, the Allies were across the Rhine in strength. Model's Army Group B was encircled in the Ruhr pocket. On the 1st of April, exactly 9 months after Rundstedt's forbidden sentence, Model shot himself in a forest rather than surrender. Rundstedt received the news while packing a single suitcase in a requisitioned hotel in the Harz Mountains. He was arrested by American soldiers on the 1st May 1945, near Bad Tölz. They found an old man in a threadbare greatcoat, sitting on a bench feeding birds. He offered no resistance. When the lieutenant asked if he was indeed General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt, he answered in perfect English, "I was. The war is over. I am simply an old man who is very tired." They took him to England, to a country house in Wiltshire, where former German generals were kept under loose guard. He spent the days reading Tacitus and playing scat with Speer and Donitz. The British interrogators came and went, polite, almost embarrassed. They asked about war crimes. He answered with the same icy precision he had once used on situation maps. "I commanded armies. I did not command crematoria. If you seek monsters, look to the men who wore party badges, not field gray." They never charged him. In 1949 he was released, quietly, without ceremony. He returned to Germany a ghost. No pension, no honors, no visitors except his son and a few old comrades who still dared to be seen with him. He lived in a small flat in Hanover, supported by a British Army allowance that he accepted with the same shrug he had once accepted the Knight's Cross with diamonds. He refused all interviews. When journalists knocked, he sent the maid to say the field marshal was not at home to history. Only once, in 1951, did he break the silence. A young American historian named John Toland found his way past the maid and asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Herr Generalfeldmarschall, on the 1st of July 1944 you told Keitel to end the war. Do you regret those words?" Rundstedt looked at him for a long time with those winter steel eyes. Then he said, very softly, "Regret? No. I regret only that I waited 25 days to speak them. 10 million dead might have lived if I had said them on 7th of June. He rose, indicating the audience was over. He died on the 24th of February 1953, aged 77, of heart failure. The same heart that had carried the weight of 3 lost wars. The funeral was small, no swastikas, no steel helmets, no marching bands, just a few old soldiers in civilian coats and a Lutheran pastor who spoke of duty and forgiveness. They buried him in the soldiers' cemetery at Hanover-Stucken, beneath a simple stone that bears only his name, his dates, and the crest of the old Prussian general staff. No epitaph was needed. The epitaph had already been spoken 9 years earlier, into a trembling telephone line, on the 25th day after the sky fell on Normandy. He told them to end the war. They ended themselves instead. The lesson was not written on his gravestone, but it is carved into the ruins of the century that followed. When an organization, army, company, government, church, begins to punish the bearer of bad news, it has already carries its own death warrant. When truth becomes treason, collapse is only a matter of time. When the realists are removed, only the fantasists remain to steer the ship onto the rocks. Rundstedt was not a hero. He was not a resistor. He signed the orders that sent millions to their deaths. He served a criminal regime longer than honor should have allowed. But in the end, when the fortress of lies was already crumbling, he did the one thing the regime could not forgive. He told the truth aloud. And for that single sentence, quiet, exhausted, accurate, history remembers him not as the victor of France in 1940, not as the planner of Barbarossa, not as the last commander in the West, but as the old man who looked at the end of the world and refused to call it a temporary difficulty. The guns are silent now. The maps have turned to dust. The empires he served are footnotes. But somewhere, in every headquarters where bad news is still being rewritten into good, where realism is still labeled defeatism, where the leader's mood matters more than the enemy's strength, an old Prussian voice can still be heard, calm and cold and merciless. Machen Sie doch endlich den verdammten Krieg zu. End it. What else can you do? For more untold truths of World War II, the hidden battles inside the command rooms, the moral collisions no textbook records, the moments when one sentence changed everything, subscribe for the hidden history no one else will tell.